Welcome to Cogsci 2021. I'm Mark Turner, and we are the Symposium on Blending in Animal Cognition. Animals are astoundingly impressive notions from long, long ago that human beings are somehow superior to non-human animals in all ways and inferior to the gods. This is a great chain of being theory of humankind, are dead. We know that we cannot fly like birds, echolocate like bats, smell as well as dogs. Plants are impressive too. We can't photosynthesize, and our genome is only 1/7 as large as the genome of the Norwegian spruce tree. Many researchers have investigated the ways in which perceptual and conceptual integration can be done by non-human animal species. If you co-locate across time and space to perceive an event, an action by an agent, that is a kind of integration. If you remember something, like getting into the forest to help you with the present situation, perhaps you want to get out of the forest, that's a kind of integration. Object permanence requires integration. Chimpanzees seem to be able to understand that conspecifics are goal-oriented agents, much like themselves. Very, very impressive. But as Glenberg pointed out, when we call up another conceptual array, you'd think that it should not conflict too severely with the present environment. Otherwise, you would be subject to delusion. So, if you want to get out of the forest and you call up how you got into the forest, the memory is subordinated to the present environment and the cognition that it induces. But human beings can call up radically incompatible memories. They can call up radically incompatible conceptual spaces, and more impressive, they can blend them. Standard example of this kind of impressive blending, riddle of the Buddhist monk. There is a Buddhist monk. He arrives before dawn at the foot of a mountain path. At the breaking of dawn, he ascends the path, which he traverses by sunset. That is, he reaches the summit at sunset, sits down, meditates overnight, arises the next dawn, and walks back down to the foot of the mountain path, which he reaches at sunset. Riddle. Not assuming anything about his speed or whether he backtracks, anything like that, but merely that he stays on the path as he traverses it. Is there a spot on the path that the monk occupies at the same hour of the day on the two successive days, the ascent and the descent? People frequently find this riddle very challenging, but one way to solve it is simply to impose the day of the ascent onto the day of the descent, to blend them. Then at dawn, there are two monks, one at the foot of the path, one at the top of the path, and as the sun crosses in the sky from dawn to sunset, they move in opposite directions, reaching the opposite ends of the path. Well, we know no matter how they move, they have to cross somewhere, maybe several times. And the place is where the monk meets himself. This solves the riddle. This may sound merely inductive and anecdotal, but if you go to markturner.org and click on the monks, you'll see a paper I wrote with 3 different kinds of mathematical proof. All 3 of the proofs are, of course, blends. Blending is so important to mathematical insight that it is encoded into mathematical methodology. Now we have cross-space mappings. The monk corresponds to the monk, the mountain path corresponds to the mountain path, the dawn corresponds to the dawn, and so on. Notice none of this is metaphoric. And in the blend, we have elements that are selectively projected and treated. So The mountain paths are fused in the blend, but the two monks are not. We also have the emergent structure of a meeting. There is a meeting in the blend. There is no meeting in any of the inputs, right? This solves the riddle. Blending for human beings of this sort combines things that shouldn't be confused. An ascent is very different from a descent. One should not think that in the story of the Buddhist monk, there are suddenly two monks, but we are not deluded. On the contrary, we achieve insight. This blend stretches across time and space. Human beings are exceptionally good at blends across causation, agency, time, and space. Now, there are great ranges of evidence for various kinds of blending. And blending is a process, not a graph, not an illustration. Blending is a process that can occur across any kind of mental space network, and they of course come in all kinds. Work can be done at any spot in the network. Blending is not a sequential process where one must step through a series, a recipe, and algorithm. On the contrary, there are constraints, there are opportunities, there are optimality principles. So if you take something like land yacht, which means a luxury vehicle, the land is not the counterpart of the yacht. You don't blend the land with the yacht. On the contrary, you get one word, land, that helps you call up probably a mental space in which there is an automobile that moves upon roads on land. And yacht lets you call up a mental space in which there is water, and the yacht moves across the water. The car is, of course, the counterpart of the yacht. The land is the counterpart of the sea. And in the blend, we have this amazing wonder. That is a car that indicates the luxury and standing of its owner. Perhaps there's a driver. Perhaps there are little opera windows in the back seat. Perhaps the car moves in a slightly fluid manner. It's not a zippy, shredding little speedster, something like that. Nominal compounds very frequently call for these kinds of blends that can be extremely impressive in the way in which the selective projection works. So if you have a caffeine headache, where I come from, coastal California, this means the headache you have because you haven't had your coffee, right? Now, we have a general notion of cause and effect, and we can apply that to headaches, so headaches can have causes. And we have another mental space in which we have our coffee. And in the elaboration of the space with the coffee, we don't have a headache. But there's also the space in which something happens, but it didn't actually include coffee. So there's a counterfactual relationship between having the coffee and not having the coffee. And that counterfactual relationship can be collapsed into absence of coffee, absence of caffeine. Now we can blend the causation of the headache, the cause, with the absence of the caffeine. And in the blend, the absence of caffeine, because one didn't have coffee, produces the headache. And we can prompt for this complicated blend by saying caffeine headache. By the way, this isn't unusual. An arousal problem usually doesn't mean that there's arousal. A money problem doesn't mean there's a lot of money. An iron deficiency doesn't mean lots of iron. A rice famine doesn't mean you have too much rice. These patterns are highly productive in human language. Now, the mental space networks can come in all kinds. There is an ocean of possibilities for blending process to go forward. Some kinds of patterns are so frequent that they've gotten names, but one should not think that this is a typology or a taxonomy of blends. When one analyzes blending, one shouldn't begin with a note card that has 5 kinds of blend on it and ask, well, which kind is this? But something like the mental space network and its blend for the Buddhist monk has been called a mirror network, just to mean that the inputs in the blend all share a frame, in this case, traversal of a mountain path. Another mirror network would be the cartoon published in the New York Times when someone set a record in the 1-mile race in order to impress us with how fast that person was. The New York Times put in the cartoon images of the little stick figures of the fastest milers from the previous 5 decades, something like that. So all of the winners who were world record setters are projected from their individual mental spaces. Talk about across time, space, causation, and agency. And in the blend, we get a mythic race between these world record setters. And in the blend, one can say, the new world record setter defeated Roger Bannister by 150 yards or something like that. Makes no sense whatever for the multiple input spaces, but it makes great sense for the blend. And the blend helps us understand the relationship between the input spaces. Blending often does this. It gives us a compact, compressed conception that we can use as a platform to reach up and understand complicated parts of networks that might otherwise be intractable. When we take 2 spaces that conflict in sort of all of their deep frame level components, that somehow got called a double scope blend. Remember, this is not a taxonomy, but examples are things like you're digging your own financial grave, right? One space has a sexton digging a grave with repeated action. Another space has long-term financial investment that's going to go wrong. The causal structure, the intentional structure, the participant structure all conflict, but it doesn't matter. The human being is able to compress them to a blend that, as it were, provides a stable perch for looking at the whole network. Now, in early theory of blending and going on, we suggested that the best evolutionary story we could see was that blending is a climb. And we certainly are on that climb with other animals. And that human beings made an extra step 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 years ago to double scope blending. That is, blending across things that dramatically conflict. And that this resulted in a great range of creativity that we see in art, music, religion, mathematical insight, scientific discovery, advanced tool use, advanced social cognition, fashion, you name it. Certainly language and grammar. So sometimes a small difference in causes can make a big difference in effects. This is studied in complexity theory and chaos theory. It's easy to illustrate. A little more lift and you're flying instead of jumping. Just a little less density and you're floating instead of drowning. A little colder temperature and the liquid water turns into ice. There are these tipping effects, and our proposal to, of course, be discussed in evolutionary psychology and the study of animal cognition is that human beings were on a climb with mammals and various kinds of ways, and just got off the charts through a small change in the functionality of the process. And what that would mean to us, we also proposed that we should have a research program investigating rudimentary blending in non-human animals. We gave an example, which was an example that is attested. A retriever is raised from a pup by a single person who plays fetch with the retriever. And the fetch they play is a little bit complicated. The stick has to be brought back to just a certain spot and so on. But when the dog trained in fetch using its evolutionary powers for retrieval meets a new human being, the dog seems to be able to understand that this human being could play fetch just like the master. Now, this is quite an interesting frame extension, because now an element that was in the frame for playing fetch becomes a role. That is, the human being can have different values. Very, very impressive. But it's accurate to say that the program on the capacities for blending in non-human animals really awaits its development. And I'm happy to say that we're now going to move directly to papers by my colleagues on this symposium, who will present theories and evidence about blending in non-human animals. I'll come back at the final discussion at the end of this symposium. Thank you.